Hello, Fremont. Today, we will be looking at the last part of the last chapter of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 13 through 22. And what a roller coaster this book of the Bible has been these last few weeks. We started the story with a man who decided to leave the promised land and move to Moab with the plan of building a life for his family. And we finished the story with the genealogy of King David, with a Moabite woman as an ancestor of Jesus. Go ahead and pause the video and read the passage. Finally, a marriage! It's been a long road, but finally Boaz and Ruth are married. Finally, Naomi and Ruth are redeemed, protected, cared for. Finally, a child is born, and we see just how important this marriage is for God's own plan to redeem the nations. While for the 10 years Ruth was married to Malone, she was unable to conceive. In her marriage to Boaz, the Lord gave her conception, and Obed was born. The birth of this baby is far more important than the impact it had on Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. God, a covenant-keeping God, has acted to bring redemption to his people through the birth of this baby. And this is a redemption story that ripples across many generations, right into our own modern-day lives. But more on that in a minute. First, let's talk about each of the main players, because the narrator gives us some big pieces of information in this seemingly small wrap-up passage. First, Boaz. We know from previous chapters that he is a man of good standing in Bethlehem. Now we learn that Boaz's name will be remembered in Bethlehem because of the lineage of his son. Names play a big role in this passage. The chapter ends with 2 different lists of names. The narrator has been tossing us gems all throughout the book of Ruth, and the final verses is no different. Boaz didn't just marry a woman who can work all day in the field and carry a heavy bag of grain. He married a Moabite widow and created a genealogy line that would carry down to King David and then on to Jesus. We start the book of Ruth with the narrator telling us it was the time when judges ruled and everyone did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And we end with the book of Ruth with the genealogy of Israel's most famous king. Boaz's name will be known through the ages. The end of chapter 4 brings us big information about Naomi also. With the birth of Obed, we watch her transform from an empty woman who had lost her husband and sons, was saddled with a widow daughter-in-law from Moab, and was begging to be called Mara, into a woman who cradles her grandson and is finally fulfilled by God's grace. Naomi is redeemed, and she basks in the joy of the birth and the compliment that her daughter-in-law Ruth is more to her than 7 sons. And finally, Ruth. Ruth has come a long way. Ruth from Moab found herself a widow and dramatically bound herself to Naomi, entering into Bethlehem with Naomi as a foreigner. She worked gleaning in the fields all day with only a short rest in the shade. She found welcome from Boaz despite her standing as a foreigner. Boaz was also a relative of Naomi's husband and their kinsman redeemer. Ruth became the wife of an upstanding citizen, a daughter-in-law who is described as being better than 7 sons and the great-grandmother of Israel's future king. Each step of the way through the book of Ruth, we see redemption. When Naomi was at her lowest, Ruth made it clear nothing would tear Ruth away from Naomi. Boaz publicly redeemed Ruth, and as a result, Naomi, despite Ruth's status as a foreigner widow. The women of Bethlehem welcomed and celebrated the birth of Obed. These are human acts that make a person feel they have worth and value. But even more important than the human acts is what the Lord did for each of them in the book of Ruth. The Lord, our covenant-keeping God, is the Redeemer behind these human acts of welcome and redemption. And this is true for our life. The Lord is the Redeemer behind each of our stories also. When we have felt at our lowest, our most lost, in deep despair where we might ask to be called Mara, when we can't see a way out, the Lord seeks us out. He welcomes us. He redeems us. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have been seated next to him in heaven, made co-heirs, and been blessed with every spiritual blessing. We are children of God, and our story is part of God's huge, sweeping plan to redeem the nations. In Christ, we have rest and redemption for our souls forever. See you on Sunday.